Mhm. Mhm. Okay. Welcome everyone to Journeys Through the Books of the Prophets. Tonight we are finishing the book of Yehoshua, which means next week we start the book of Shoftim, the book of Judges. So we're beginning in chapter 19. We will be doing 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, and 24 tonight, followed by the insights into the Haftorah. So we begin in chapter 19. I'll just review that in chapter 18, it's made clear that a lot of the land had not been conquered, and therefore many of the tribes had not really gotten their inheritance yet. The idea was that we would conquer all of Eretz Yisrael, and everyone would go to their Nachalah, their inheritance. And we learned also last week that the conquering of the land took 7 years, and then it became quiet. In a certain way, Israel had done what it could do. The nations around kind of backed off. And then the process of inheriting the land took 7 years. So it's 14 years, 7 to conquer and 7 to distribute the inheritances to each tribe. And at the end of chapter 18, so we see that the 2.5 tribes that took their inheritance on the other side of the Jordan, so Yehoshua confirms that that will be their inheritance. And Manasseh, remember, it's only a half a tribe of Manasseh. Manasseh also got a portion in Eretz Yisrael, the main part of Eretz Yisrael. And the first 2 tribes that were given their Nachalah was Yehuda and Yosef / Ephraim. And therefore, we see that there were still 7 tribes that needed their inheritance. And so Yehoshua, and this is a review, Yehoshua picked 3 people from each tribe, and I call them the surveyors. And they were sent to go to what they thought would be their inheritance, and like to map it out, to see what it was like. They come back, and then they do the goral, they do the lottery. And they do the lottery along with the Kohen Gadol, the Urim and Tumim. And it turns out that exactly where each tribe was supposed to get their inheritance, that's how the lottery came out. It was, we'll call it hashgacha pratit. It was divine providence that everyone got the exact inheritance that was meant for them. Usually when you think of a lottery, you think of chance. They pulled out the name of one tribe, and then they had the inheritance. So in theory, it could have gotten all mixed up, but it didn't. It was exactly how God had promised to each of the tribes. And that's how we ended the class last week. So in this week's Parsha, in chapter 19, and we're not going to go into very many of the details here because it is very detailed, exactly what the borders were, the different villages and towns that they set up, which families, but I'll just give you the order. In chapter 19, the way that the lottery came out, again, after the 3 tribes of Gad, Reuben, and Manasseh get on the other side of the Jordan, and then Manasseh also gets in Eretz Yisrael, and Yehuda and Ephraim get there. So there's 7 tribes left, and that's what chapter 19 is about. It's a long chapter, and the order that the lottery comes out is Shimon, and we see that there's something unique about the inheritance of Shimon, that he gets a portion, but it's within the portion of Yehuda. It is called the portion of Shimon, but it's surrounded by Yehuda. And that, I believe we discussed already, because of different things that happened with Shimon going back up to a few generations, back to Yaakov. And so Shimon gets his inheritance within Yehuda. It's what we call the south of Israel, actually the northern part of the Negev. That's where Shimon gets his inheritance. And then the second one, the first one is really is Binyamin. That was in last week's parsha. I'm sorry. Of the 7, 6 are in chapter 19, but 1 was already in 18 of the 7, and that was Binyamin. So Binyamin got, and it turns out where I live is very, very close to the inheritance of Binyamin. I'm in the inheritance of Ephraim, but it's very, very close. It's actually a bit hard to tell, but at least on the way that they've divided up what are called the regional councils, Binyamin is like 10 minutes away from here, and we fall in what's called Ephraim. So Binyamin was actually the first of the 7 that still needed their inheritance. Second was Shimon. Third was Zevulun. Fourth was Yisachar, and we know that Zevulun and Yisachar go together. That Zevulun was the one who was supporting Yisachar, and the tribe of Yisachar was famous for their scholars. The 5th one was Asher, and the 6th one was Naphtali, and the last one was Dan. And there's many discussions that we're not going to go into, like why this particular order. And there are many, many different opinions of why this order turned out this way. But it's interesting that Zevulun and Yisachar are right next to each other. And the last one is Dan. And when the tribes camped around the Mishkan, the last tribe that marched, when the cloud would move from above the Mishkan, the last tribe that would march in the formation was Dan. And here also, he's the last one to get his inheritance. It doesn't mean that he was less than anyone. It's just that his function it's actually said that Dan was like in charge of picking up all the lost items. You can imagine you have up to 3 million people marching through the desert. People are going to drop things along the way. And since Dan was the last one, they had like the mitzvah of returning lost objects. It's one of the mitzvahs in the Torah that if you find a lost object and it has a recognizable mark on it or a siman that you could actually possibly find the owner, it's a big mitzvah to go out of your way to try to return it. So then at the end of chapter 19, we see that Yehoshua gets his inheritance. Yehoshua is part of the tribe of Yosef, and his inheritance is in the portion of Yosef. And in, one second. So at the end of chapter 19, it says, V'yachlu l'nachel et eretz ligvuloteha, and they finished dividing up the land according to the borders of the tribes. V'yitnu b'nei Yisrael nachala liYeshua. And then it was Yeshua's turn to get his nachala. So this is actually a beautiful idea about leadership. Many, many times the leader is who grabs first. Here, Yehoshua takes last. Yeshua gets last. And it says, Al pi Hashem natnu lo et ha'ir asher sha'al et tmunat serach. So the town that he was given was near Shechem. Again, he's from Yosef. And Yosef gets the city of Shechem. And Yehoshua, and I think we mentioned way back that according to the Arizal, Yehoshua is a reincarnation of Yosef. So his particular Nachala is in this place called Timnat Serach, Bahar Ephraim. It's in the mountain of Ephraim. Again, and Ephraim goes with Yosef. Vayivnu et ha'ir v'yashev ba, and he built the city and he dwelt there. Yehoshua, according to tradition, we know where Yeshua is buried, and it turns out to be it's in an Arab village right now near Shechem, and people still go to it. It's somewhat bordering on dangerous, but people go. I know people who go to the grave of Yehoshua ad yom hazeh, until this very day. Okay, now chapter 20, most of the parsha is about, and I'll read the first verse of chapter 20. It says, V'yadaber Hashem el Yehoshua lemor. God spoke to Yehoshua, saying, Daber b'nei Yisrael, speak to the children of Israel, lemor, saying, Tenu lachem et ari miklat asher debarti alechem b'yad Moshe. So God says to Yehoshua, set aside, give, and make the cities of refuge that I spoke to you through Moshe. So this goes back to the book of Bamidbar, and the cities of refuge are mentioned actually many times in the Torah. And a number of the explanations are fairly lengthy. Obviously, a very, very important idea that if someone, it's given together, if someone kills purposely, and there are two witnesses and they're warned, then the penalty could be a death penalty. But if someone kills someone inadvertently, by accident, did not mean to do such a thing, but was somewhat culpable, then they were given 6 cities of refuge that they had to go to and live, as we're going to see shortly, until the Kohen Gadol of that time passes away. It could be that a person is there for a day or a year or the rest of their life. It's totally dependent on when the Kohen Gadol passes away. And we learn that actually everyone who kills on purpose or inadvertently would go to a city of refuge, and there they would be judged. And if they were found to have murdered on purpose, and there were the proper witnesses, etc., they could get the death penalty. But if it could be proven that they murdered someone inadvertently, then they would have the right to stay in the Ir Miklat. Not the right, they had to, but it was also to protect them from what are called the blood avengers, from the relatives who might kind of go after them in revenge. So in chapter 20, most of chapter 20 is about these cities. And Yehoshua, and there's a whole review, like I just did, of the whole procedure of the cities. But I want to read to you the names of the cities and where they are. And that is in verses 7 and 8 in chapter 20. And for those who have the art scroll, in Parshat Maseh, the last Parsha of Bamidbar, there's a map in the art scroll that shows the three cities on this side of the Jordan and the three cities on the other side of the Jordan. And so in verses 7 and 8, it names the cities. And I'm just going to point out that they were strategically located between north, middle, and south of Israel, that someone who had to flee to a city of refuge, they'd have one somewhat close to them. They weren't all bunched together in north or south or middle. There was one up north, one in the middle, and one down south. And so in verse 7, it says, V'yikadshehu et Kadesh b'Galil. So here it actually mentions the Galilee. Already we see the name of the Galil. And one of the reasons why is it called Galil is when you look at the word, it's based on the root gal. Gal means a wave. Now, for those who have been in Israel, you know that up north, it becomes very hilly and very mountainous. And depending where you are, you can see the waves of the hills for a great distance. It's like waves of the sea. And you can't see it in every place, but one of my favorite places is at the top of Mount Meron. It's been off limits for almost the last year, because on the top of Mount Meron is a very, very high technological radar system for the whole north of Israel. And Hezbollah has been bombing it off and on for the last year. But around the top of the mountain, right underneath the army base, is a trail that goes around the top of the mountain. And from there, you get these vistas that you see the rolling hills and mountains of the Galil. It's absolutely breathtaking. So the first city that's mentioned here is called Kadesh, comes from the root of holy. That was the name of the city in the Galil. So that's the northern one. Bahar Naphtali. That is in what's called Har Naphtali. To this day, there is a yeshuv called Ramat Naphtali, which is right south of Kiryat Shmona. South of Kiryat Shmona, up in the mountains. Now, it doesn't mean this is the exact place where it was, but it's in the area. So this is the northern part, and we have to remember that southern Lebanon for centuries was part of Israel. The actual Lebanon, as it's constituted now, about half of Lebanon was part of the inheritances of of the tribes. So that's how we can understand this one up north. Today, it's very close to the northern border. But in ancient times, the northern border was substantially north into Lebanon. So that's the first one, Kadesh Bagalil, Bahar Naphtali. The next one, in what we're going to call the middle of the country, Vayet Shechem, Bahar Ephraim. Now, Shechem has come up in the book of Yehoshua a number of times and throughout Jewish history. We'll discuss that more. One second. In the 24th chapter, we'll discuss about Shechem a little bit more. So that's what's called the middle of the country. Ve'et Kiryat Arba, Hi Chevron, Bahar Yehuda. And the southern one was Hebron, Kiryat Arba. That was in Yehuda. That's called the south. So here you have Eretz Yisrael divided into thirds with a city of refuge in each part of the country. Now, what about the other side of the Jordan? So in verse 8, it continues, Ume'aver liyarden Yericho, Mizracha, and on the other side of the Jordan, on the other side of Jericho, Natnu et Betzer Bamidbar. So the southern one was called Betzer in the Midbar. So that's what we're going to call around the Dead Sea, the Negev, B'mishor b'mate Ruven, and more north, we call it in the middle of these three tribes, is a place called Mishor. V'yet Ra'amot b'Galad. Excuse me, I'm correcting myself. The second one was in the tribe of Reuven, and the heights of Gilad, and that's what it was called, Ramot Gilad. Again, that's in more the center. That I would imagine that's like across from where Beit Shan is. People who know the map of Israel, across from the Gilboa, on the other side of the Jordan. And then, very interesting, is it's in the news today, Vayet Golan bebashan, b'mate Menashe. And the northern one was called Golan. And to this day, we call the northern part of Israel the Golan Heights. That was the northern one. So those are the six. So that's quite interesting. Again, Kadesh, Shechem, and Hebron on this side of the Jordan. And on the other side was Betzer, Ramot Gilad, and Golan bebashan. Those were the six. So I just want to say a little bit more about the cities of refuge. That this is a Torah I learned from Rav Ginsburg. It says in the Gemara that these might have been with the first street signs. You go on any street, any highway, and there's lots of street signs. And in Israel, going all the ways back, they put up signs with directions to the closest city of refuge. And on it was written Miklat, Miklat. Miklat means refuge. In modern day, our bomb shelters is called a Miklat. That's where you take refuge at a time of war. I am sitting right now in my Miklat. I live in my Miklat. Most of the day, I'm in my Miklat. But the question is, why does it say it twice? Miklat, Miklat. So Rav Ginsburg proposes that if you look at the gematria of miklat. Each word is 179. Times 2 is 358. That should ring a bell. Mashiach. Mashiach. And so my explanation about this is that throughout Jewish history, considering all of the wars and oppression and exiles and expulsions and Kristallnachts and Holocausts and pogroms and inquisitions, our miklat, our space of refuge, was the solid belief in a better world that would come. Because if you go through all of that, you could ask, how did we hold on? How did we hold on through that kind of a history? And the truth is, many Jews didn't hold on. For many Jews, it was just, this is just too much, and they would do whatever they could to kind of disappear into regular society. But for most of our history, you just couldn't do that. If you were Jewish, you were stuck in your position. So this is just an idea that our city of refuge, in a spiritual sense, in a deeply spiritual sense, is our core belief in the goodness of the world, the goodness of Hashem, the importance of our tradition, and especially this belief that one day Mashiach will come and will bring the whole world together in peace and harmony. Okay, now just a word about why is it that the person has to stay in the Ari Miklat, the city of refuge, until the high priest passes away. It's not like a logical kind of formula that one would come up with. It's not like a person is sentenced for 5 years or 10 years or rehabilitation. They have to stay there until the Kohen Gadol passes away. So there are many ideas. What's the connection here? So one of the connections is that the Kohen Gadol holds all of Israel on their shoulders. That's why in the garments of the Kohen Gadol, he had a breastplate that he wore over his heart, but on his 2 shoulders were 2 shoham stones, and engraved were on one side were the 6 of the tribes, and the other side the other 6 tribes. And this is what we would call symbolically, what we call today of carrying the whole world on your shoulders. The Kohen Gadol literally had the responsibility, the spiritual responsibility for all of Israel. And so it's one of the ideas is that if someone would murder in Israel, it's perhaps because the Kohen Gadol had not prayed enough that something like this should not happen in Israel. This is just one of the ideas. The other one is when the Kohen Gadol passes away. So we're told that when a tzaddik passes away, when a righteous person passes away, there is an atonement that spreads to the generation. We said in Hallel, Yakar be'enei Hashem hamafta l'chasidav. Precious in the eyes of God are the death of his righteous ones. And we're actually told that there's different degrees of atonement, different degrees of tshuva. And some of the degrees that one can do tshuva and one could be granted atonement on Yom Kippur, but there's certain things that only with our own death is there a full atonement. But the Kohen Gadol represents all of Israel. Especially on Yom Kippur, he does the service for all of Israel. So when the Kohen Gadol passes away, then all those who are in an Ari Miklat, this kind of atonement spreads to them spiritually. Another idea is that I'm talking about Yom Kippur again, when the Kohen Gadol goes into the Holy of Holies once a year with the incense, is that if his prayer is pure enough, then there would be no murders. So somehow there's this idea of the Kohen Gadol as the representative of God to Israel and Israel to God. The Kohen Gadol does two tasks. He's a representative of God to Israel, but he's also the representative of Israel to God. And therefore, if there is murders in Israel, it somehow reflects spiritually on the Kohen Gadol. It's not the easiest concept to understand because it's counterintuitive that the two would be linked together. Therefore, the commentaries look for some deep connection here. Now we go to chapter 21. And here we see that a good part of this chapter is, and I'll read the first verse and then we'll see what it's about. So it says, Vayikshu Roshei Avot HaLeviim. So the heads of the different families of the Levites, they approached Eleazar HaKohen. He was now the high priest, the son of Aaron. Vel Yehoshua bin Nun, and to Yehoshua. Vel Roshei Avot, and to all the heads of the various tribes. Hamatot Livnei Yisrael. V'yedabru aleihem b'Shilo. And this occurred in Shiloh. And this is important because we learned last week that the Mishkan was brought in Yeshua's time to Shiloh. Shiloh is in the inheritance of Yosef. And there it was for, I think, 369 years. I think that's the correct number. In other words, it was there for a long time. According to the Talmud, the Mishkan was actually in, I believe, 8 different places, but most of them were for relatively short time. But Shiloh, that was the main place of the Mishkan, and there is a settlement in Shiloh, and it's in the exact same place as where the Mishkan was. And so all the Levites, or the representatives of the Levites, come to Yehoshua and Eleazar Kohen and the heads of the tribes in Shiloh, u'migrashehen lebehemtenu, and they basically asked that the promise that God made to the Levim, which is repeated many times in the Torah, many times where it says the Levim get no land inheritance in Eretz Yisrael, but they got 42 cities. They got 42 cities and a small amount of land around each city. So in a way, it's a misnomer to say that the Levim didn't get an inheritance. And one of the reasons is the Levim were, their purpose, their task were to be the spiritual teachers and leaders of Israel. Remember, the Kohanim come from the Levim. Aharon was a Levi. Moshe was a Levi. And so it's fairly obvious that instead of there having one body of land, it could have been up north, could have been south, it could have been in the middle, but they were spread all over Israel so that everyone would have access to them. And of those 42 cities, the 6 that we mentioned are also cities of the Levim. The cities of refuge are among the 42 cities that they received. So most of the chapter of 21 is mentioning which families of the Levim got which cities, which villages. It's very, very detailed. And as I mentioned a number of times, one of the fascinating things about the book of Yehoshua is that so many names in modern Israel are names from the book of Yehoshua. And as mentioned, some of them are in virtually the exact same places as mentioned in the book of Yehoshua, but in most cases, they're not. In other words, last week we discussed a city called Kiryat Sefer. Kiryat Sefer was near to Hebron. It's obvious from the context of why it was mentioned. And yet, 10 minutes from me is a very, very big and growing Haredi city called Kiryat Sefer. So it's just that the name was taken. It doesn't mean that that's where Kiryat Sefer was. I am not taking the time to go into this, but it's very fascinating when you read through the details here, how many names are used today in modern Israel. Now, one of them, and I don't think I marked it, was in one of these chapters, it mentions Tzfat. But it mentions Tzfat in the context of someplace down south. And I myself was a bit puzzled how that works. In other words, when did Tzfat get the name Tzfat? And that I can't answer. I didn't have time to Google it to see when Tzfat was actually called Tzfat. You should just know that Tzfat comes from the root to see, to look, to gaze. And that's why where Hebrew University is in Jerusalem is called Harat Sofim, the mountain of view. Anyone who's been up on Harat Sofim, from one of the angles, you can see virtually the entire city of Jerusalem, the whole thing. It's the same root, it's Tzfat. Sofim, the Tzadi Pei of Sofim and Tzfat come from the same root. And unfortunately, I didn't mark it down where it is, but I really took notice of it, that it was part of one of the tribes that were much more down south than the Tzfat that we know today. So that is just something that maybe we'll all look at. Maybe, well, some of you are watching, you could Google, when did Tzfat get its name Tzfat? Okay, so that is the 21st chapter. In the 22nd chapter, and we're going to go a little bit faster now because I'm committed to finishing the book of Yehoshua tonight. So in the 22nd chapter, it reviews again the idea of the 2.5 tribes getting their inheritance on the other side of the Jordan. And it just begins where Yehoshua calls these 2.5 tribes, and he kind of gives it like a pat on the back. Because if you remember, when in the time of Moshe, when the 2.5 tribes asked for an inheritance on the other side, Moshe said, what, you're going to stay on the other side of the Jordan while your brothers fight to conquer Eretz Yisrael? And so they worked out an agreement that the 2.5 tribes, the men of army age, would cross the Jordan and fight with all of Israel to conquer the land on the west side of the Jordan. And here in chapter 22, as we said, the 7 years of conquest are over. We also mentioned that sprinkled through all of the inheritances, it mentions which of the peoples that we were supposed to have conquered and we didn't were left where they were, and they ended up living within the borders of each tribe. And so here in the 21st chapter, Yehoshua is kind of giving the tribes that are going to now inherit on the other side a pat on the back, saying, you fulfilled your promise. It's now 7 years later. The wars of conquest are over. The time of inheritance has come. You can now go back to the other side of the Jordan. So that fills most of chapter 22. But what happens is the tribes go to the other side of the Jordan, and word gets back that they've built an altar. And when the tribes in Israel hear this, they're outraged. Like, we have the Mishkan in Shiloh. That is the only place that we can offer sacrifices. That's where the service of the Mishkan happens. Why are they building an altar on the other side of the Jordan? And there was a fear that they were going to separate from the rest of Israel. And the people were so outraged, they were ready to go to war. It was like a civil war was brewing. So how did they solve this problem? So they sent Pinchas. Pinchas, we know from the book of Bamidbar, they sent him to find out what is going on. And in the whole second part of the 22nd chapter, so Pinchas comes and says, people are really upset. Why are you building an altar? Are you planning to serve other gods? What is going on here? And the people say, Chas v'chalila, literally. They say, Chas v'chalila, that this is why we built the altar. We built the altar because we are far away from you. We're far away from Shiloh, and we have absolutely no intention of offering sacrifices or worshiping any other god. But we wanted an altar so that our children would see the connection between us and the altar in Shiloh. And so when Pinchas heard this, he said, I accept that. If that is your purpose, that's your promise. So he went back to the people and assured them that the tribes were not planning on splitting off or serving other gods. The last 2 chapters of the book of Yehoshua, chapters 23 and 24, they very much go together. This, in a sense, is Yehoshua's last speech to the people. And we see in this almost a replica of the entire book of Devarim. The whole book of Devarim happened in 37 days. We know that because in Parshat Devarim, it says that Moshe began speaking to the people on the first day of the month of Shvat, the 11th month, and Moshe passed away 37 days later on the 7th of Adar. So the whole book is as if one long speech, one long last will and testament of Moshe. So the 23rd and 24th chapters, Yehoshua is doing very similar. And in the 23rd chapter, it's like a review of all of Jewish history, of the whole Torah. 23 and 24, I'm just going to deal with them almost as like one flow. And he warns the people not to go after other gods. He warns the people, he encourages the people to safeguard the Torah, to love God, to give it over to their children. And he reminds them how God took us out of Egypt and protected us through the 40 years in the desert and was with us as we conquered as much of Eretz Yisrael as we could. So we see, though, in the beginning of chapter 23, it says that Yehoshua called the people together. And I'll read the first verse of chapter 23. It says, Vayehi biyamim rabim. So it was after many days, acharei asher hiniach Hashem liYisrael, that God gave rest to Israel in the land. Mikol oivehem misaviv. He gave them rest from all of their enemies around them. Yehoshua zaken ba biyamim. That Yehoshua was now elderly and he was coming into days, meaning his time to leave this world was approaching. And then it says, Vayikra Yehoshua l'kol Yisrael, l'ziknav, l'roshav, l'shovtav, l'shotrev, v'yomer alehem, ani zakanti, bati biyamim. He calls together the elders, the heads of the tribes, the judges, the enforcers of law, and he calls them, he says, I am now old, and I am preparing to leave this world. And so that's the introduction to his whole speech in chapter 23. Interestingly enough, in chapter 24, it seems to be a repetition. And it says, Via Sof Yehoshua et kol shifte Yisrael, Shchema, Vayikra l'ziknei Yisrael uroshav uloshotrav uloshovtav uloshotrav v'yityatzvu lifnei ha'elokim. Here it says that Yehoshua gathered everyone together of the tribes in Shechem, and he called to the elders, very similar to the first verse in chapter 23. And to the heads of the tribes, and to the judges, and to the enforcers of law. And he said, stand before God. So the discussion is, was this one gathering, or was it two gatherings? And the major opinion is, it's actually two different gatherings. First, he called together everyone in Shiloh, even though it doesn't mention Shiloh. In chapter 23, he called everyone together in Shiloh. And then he called them again, obviously after a short amount of time, to Shechem. And we mentioned Shechem before. It's one of the cities of refuge. Shechem was what is basically the first place that Avram came to when he came into the land. And according to one midrash, that this is where Brit Ben Abatarim happened. The covenant of the pieces happened on the two mountains right next to Shechem, Har Grizim and Har Eval. And this is where Yaakov came. When he first came back to Eretz Yisrael, he came to Shechem. Yehoshua, when they came into Eretz Yisrael, we learned this a couple of weeks ago. They went to Shechem, they went to Har Eval, Har Grizim, and they established the covenant in Eretz Yisrael. So we can understand why Yeshua is now gathering them for really the last time, because at the end of this chapter, he passes away. But he gathers them to Shechem one last time. And near the end, it's quite interesting that it says, Vayichtov Yehoshua et ha'devarim ha'ela b'sefer Torat Elokim, vayikach even gedola, vayikameha sham tachad ha'ela asher b'migdash Hashem. So because he brought to Shechem the Aron Kodesh. And here it says that he raised up a great stone, and he also wrote in Sefer Torat Elokim. Now this is quite mysterious, because what is this book of God that he wrote in? So some say that there's actually a statement in the Talmud that had we conquered all of Eretz Yisrael, then we could have brought Mashiach then and built the temple. And it says that the only books in the Tanakh would have been the 5 books of Moshe and the book of Yehoshua. That would be all that was needed. Mashiach would come, and that would be it. So some say that when it says Sefer Torah Elokim, it's the book of Yeshua. It's talking about the book that he wrote here, and he's finishing it now, right before he passes away. Just like Moshe finishes writing the Torah right before he passes away. And in the end, so the end of chapter 24, and also this idea, also this stone that he raised up there is also somewhat mysterious, but we see a pattern. If you remember, it was probably the second class that we had in the book of Yehoshua, that when we crossed the Jordan, Yehoshua took 12 stones and raised them up in their first encampment in Gilgal, and also raised up stones in the middle of the Jordan as a remembrance for the miracles that happened. And then when they went to Har Eval and Har Grizim in order to do the blessing and curse and establish the covenant, that's where they raised up 12 other stones and wrote the whole Torah in 70 languages. And here at the end of his life, Yehoshua again is raising up this large stone. Today, we don't know really where any of these stones are, other than the fact that we know that they happened, but we don't have the remnants of these stones. But it's so interesting that from the time we come into Eretz Yisrael and the time that Yeshua passes away, and it's mentioned at the end of chapter 24 that Yeshua is 110 years old, and this is actually the idea that Yosef also lived to be 110. So this is one of the connections between Yeshua and Yosef, and Yeshua is lived and buried right near Yosef, and Yosef is buried in Shechem, quite literally in Shechem. And so the book ends with this idea of his passing away and that he's buried, as we said. And then it's interesting, it ends, verse 32, Ve'et atzmot Yosef, asher ha'alu b'nei Yisrael mimitzrayim, kavru b'Shechem, b'chelkat hasadeh asher kana Yaakov be'et b'nei Chamor avi Shechem, b'mea kesita, v'yu l'b'nei Yosef l'nachala. Here, and this is another deep connection between Yehoshua and Yosef. At the end of the book of Yehoshua, we kind of forgot that when we were leaving Egypt, the whole story of how Moshe, on the very night that we're leaving Egypt, Moshe is searching for the bones of Yosef because Yosef made Israel promise that when they leave Egypt, they would take his bones and bury him in Israel. Just like his father, Yaakov, had made Yosef promise to bury him in Israel. So the book of Yehoshua is ending now. Here, this is 14 years later. Only then are they burying Yosef in his permanent place in Shechem, which is the burial place of Yosef to this day. And one last verse, I want to end with this one, verse 31. It's such an important verse. It says, V'yavod Yisrael et Hashem kol yemei Yehoshua, v'kol yemei hazakenim asher ha'arichu yamim achrei Yehoshua, v'asher yadu et kol ma'aseh Hashem asher asa liYisrael. It says that Israel served God all the days of Yehoshua and all the days of the elders who still remembered all of the goodness that God had done for Israel when it doesn't say it, but when he took them out of Egypt. So this is an amazing thing because next week we start the book of Shoftim. And already in the book of Shoftim, Israel was starting to worship other gods. But here it says that the whole time that Yehoshua is the leader and the generation after him that was influenced by him, they served only God. So that's such a tribute to Yehoshua that his presence was so strong and the people accepted him as the leader and listened to him and did not stray from Hashem and the Torah. So that's really the greatest tribute that we could pay to Yehoshua, that the whole time that he led them, they served God. And so with that, we have finished the book of Yehoshua. And next week, we begin the book of Shoftim. And I want to thank everyone who's been on board, anyone who's watching now for the first time, and all the people who are going to watch it. We have very exciting times ahead. Shoftim, the books of Shmuel. Whoa, we got a lot of great stuff coming. Okay, as you know, we go right into insights into the Haftorah. Welcome everyone to Insights into the Weekly Haftorah. This week's parsha is Vayishlach. This is where Yaakov reconnects, confronts Esav. We're going to talk about the Haftorah, but we know that the Haftorah always follows either the major theme or one of the themes of the Torah portion. So the whole beginning of the parsha is Yaakov sending gifts, praying for peace, preparing for war, his fight with the man, angel, himself, Esav, God, his winning the wrestling match and having conferred a new name upon him, Yisrael. And then the next day he meets Esav, and instead of a huge war confrontation, they meet, and there's a very, very important Rashi that because it says that Esav kissed Yaakov, and on the word kissed, there are dots over the word kissed. And the sages had a disagreement what these dots represent. One opinion is that the kiss was not a sincere kiss. In fact, one of the midrashim say that Esav actually tried to bite his neck and kill him. But interesting enough, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the great mystic, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, says, Halacha hi Esav soneh et Yaakov. He says it's a halacha, meaning it's immutable law of nature that Esav hates Yaakov. But Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, but the dots over the word kissed indicates that in this particular situation, he was sincere. That after all of his hatred for Yaakov and actually wanting to kill him, his heart melted when he actually saw him. And this parsha talks about what they discussed, and then the parsha continues. So the Haftorah is actually it's from the shortest book of the prophets. There are three major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And there are what are called the 12 minor prophets. But it has to be pointed out, when they're called the minor prophets, it doesn't mean that their prophecies are any less important than the three major ones. It just means that their books are shorter. The Haftorah from this week is the entire book of Avadia. The whole book of Avadia is 21 verses. And there's only one other time that for a Haftorah we read an entire book. The other time is on Yom Kippur. At Mincha time, we read the entire book of Jonah. But Jonah is not a lot of chapters, but it's not just 21 verses. And so this prophet, the reason that it was chosen, we're going to see there are two. It's all about we'll call it the vengeance, the mida keneged mida that Esav will get for its oppressing Israel throughout the generations. That's what the whole book is about. Now, what's interesting here is Obadiah, he's a convert from Esav, from Edom. He was not born Jewish. He was a convert from Esav. And so in the Gemara, it says the fact that God chose him to deliver this prophecy to Edom. Now, here we see something important, because most of the prophecies are aimed or directed to Israel. But within many different prophecies, the prophet turns to neighboring nations and prophesizes about them. So the whole book of Obadiah is like warning Esav of the measure for measure that they are going to receive. And so the statement in the Gemara is that this is the perfect example. What it says, that from the forest itself comes the handle of the axe that will destroy it. Because the handle of the axe comes from the tree. So here, God chose a convert from Esav, from Edom, to prophesy against them. So, as I said, it's a relatively short Haftorah, but it doesn't mean it's not as important. And we'll see the two that I'm going to read to you is Rashi quotes from this Haftorah from the book of Obadiah in the beginning of the next parsha, Vayeshev. One second. Wait, give me 1 second. I just have to look up something. Yes, the second verse of next, not this week's parsha, next week, Vayeshev, it says, Ela toldot Yaakov Yosef. These are the generations of Yaakov, Yosef. This week's parsha ends with a long description of all of the different generals and families of Esav. It's very, very long and detailed. And so Rashi wants to know what's the juxtaposition that Parshat Vayishlach ends with this whole description of the lineage of Esav. And then the next parsha begins, these are the generations of Yaakov, Yosef. And so Rashi quotes from this Haftorah. And I'm going to read the whole part. These are verses 15 through 18 of the book of Obadiah. So it says, for the day of God over all the nations is close. As you have done will be done to you. That's what I said. Mida keneged mida. A measure for a measure. Your recompense will be returned upon your head. For as you drank on my holy mount, shall all the nations drink constantly, and they will drink and be stunned, and they will be as though they were not. And Mount Zion, there shall be a remnant, and it shall be holy, and the house of Jacob shall inherit those who inherited them. Now this next two verses is what Rashi quotes to explain what's the juxtaposition of the lineage of Esav and the generations of Yaakov is Yosef. And this is what he quotes. And the house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Yosef a flame, and the house of Esav shall become stubble, and they shall ignite them and consume them. And the house of Esav shall have no survivors, for God has spoken. So that's what Rashi quotes, the juxtaposition between the lineage of Esav and Yaakov Yosef, that in the end of days, the measure for measure will be that the flame and the fire of Yaakov and Yosef will consume Esav. And then the last verse of the book of Obadiah has been placed in our daily prayers in Shachrit. Right before we end what was called Pesukei de Zimra, there's a quote from Obadiah. And in English, it says, deliverers will ascend Mount Zion to judge the mountains of Esav, and the kingdom will be God's. And in our prayers, though, they add a verse from Zechariah. So in Hebrew, it's V'yalu Moshiim Bahar Tzion Lishpot et Har Esav, that deliverers will rise up on Mount Sion, and they will judge the mountain of Esav. And V'haita Lashem Melucha, and Hashem will be king. For those who are here at the beginning, I played the song Hashem Melech. Hashem Malach, Hashem Yimloch Leolam Bo'ed. And I said, I chose that song because it's connected to this Haftorah. But in our prayers, they add from Zechariah, V'hoy Hashem Lemelech al kol ha'oretz, V'yom hahu yeh Hashem echad u'shmo echad. And that in that day, Hashem will become king over all the earth. On that day, God will be one and his name will be one. So this is from the book of Ovadia. I want to mention a little bit more about Ovadia. He was a very, very special neshama. God willing, as we go through the books of the Nevi'im, we're going to get to the book of Malachim. And he appears in the book of Malachim in a major way. He was a student of Eliyahu Navi. At that time, the king and queen of the northern tribes, Achav and Jezebel, not just wanted, but they were killing off all of the prophets, because all the prophets were against them because they had introduced the worship of the Baal, a foreign god, especially through the king's wife. She came from a foreign country, and she introduced the worship of Baal, and it spread like wildfire in Israel. And all the prophets were speaking out against them. So the king and queen had an easy solution. We're just going to kill them all. So Ovadia, and his name is Oved Hashem. Ovadia means the servant of God. So he actually worked for the king, Achav, who was considered one of the most evil kings. But what did he do? He hid 100 prophets in a cave. And from his own resources, he fed them. And literally every day, and his wife was in on this completely, every single day they risked their lives. And they fed these 100 prophets in this cave. And one of them that survived was Eliyahu, a Navi, and he fled to Har Sinai. And later, God sent him back to Achav. And that whole story we'll get to. But Ovadia, the Gemara in Sanhedrin, says that at this point he was not a prophet, but because of his incredible, what's called Mesirut Nefesh, his selflessness in saving these 100 prophets, that God granted him prophecy. And God chose him for especially the last verse that we read, that redeemers will come to Har Sion and will judge the mountain of Esav, and Hashem will be the king. And that's we say it every single day in our prayers. And so Ovadia was a very, very special neshama. And as we've mentioned before, some of the greatest souls in Jewish history were converts. And we know that the grandmother of David HaMelech was Ruth. David HaMelech comes from a family of converts. Rabbi Akiva comes from a family of converts. Rabbi Meir comes from a family of converts. So Ovadia, and I'll just end with one last thing, that based on the story in Malachim, it says that Ovadia had great Yirat Hashem, had great awe and fear of God. And the Gemara actually says that at a certain level, he even surpassed Avram Avinu in his awe of God. And that's why he literally risked his life every day to save these prophets, because he knew they were speaking the words of God. And he was like a double agent on top of everything, because he worked in the household of the wicked king. So he was like a double agent and risking his life every day. And based on his selflessness, God chose him to be a prophet. So it's a very, very beautiful, beautiful teaching. L'chaim, everyone. Okay, if you'll actually give me 1 minute, I need to stretch. give me one minute here. I'm still with you, but I need to stretch just for a minute. Oh, I have to end Facebook. Not Facebook.